There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
$13.8 billion years ago, the universe was born. In a sudden and inexplicable expansion, it went from a tiny, dense, impossibly packed seed to a rushing cloud of gases. Time began at that moment, and prior to that moment, time didn't exist. Nothing existed, at least nothing that we know of. If something did exist prior to the great expansion of our universe, there's a good chance it will remain unknowable to us. Now, that doesn't mean we can't speculate. For centuries, we've speculated about the origin of the universe, and this was long before George Lemaitre coined the phrase Big Bang back in 1927. Now, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, you can't get something from nothing. So there had to be something prior to the Big Bang to even cause it to bang. But why? Why do we think this? Well, because we have evidence of the aftermath. First, there was nothing, or so it seems, and then there was something. How does one explain the lack of something before? Well, we can't explain it. And that doesn't mean there isn't something to explain. It just means that our current state of technology and knowledge doesn't allow for it. We have evidence of what happened after. We're living, walking proof of that. The moon and Mars, as well as all of the other solid objects which share our orbit around the sun, are evidence as well. The evidence for what was there before all of this, that's beyond our reach. It didn't leave a cosmic imprint for us to study. At least not that we've found. Yet. So the universe trucked along for 10 billion years before life first appeared on Earth. And then, 4 billion years ago, a simple-celled bacteria-like organism emerged from the ooze. It survived in our planet's harsh climate long enough to replicate. Different replication efforts were thwarted until one succeeded. This became the happy path. For another 3 to 3.5 billion years, not a lot happened. Those first few bacterial forms, those little replicators, continued to replicate. Some grouped together to form multicellular algae, and the seas were relatively quiet. And then, something caused a small splash. Now, it wasn't a big splash, and it wasn't even a real splash, not in the sense that something lifted itself out of the water and fell back into it, but in the sense that things other than simple bacteria and algae began to appear. Now that was 600 million years ago. These things left their impressions in the sandstone. They were multicellular, and they had soft bodies. Think of jellyfish-like creatures and those that resembled plant leaves. We call this group of organisms the Ediacaran fauna, since they were first discovered in the region of the same name in South Australia in 1946. Now, what made these little things special was that they were the first multicellular organisms to extract oxygen from the air. It enabled them to grow. And this was important enough to cause the small splash that I mentioned. It was a hint of things to come, a precursor that natural selection was gearing up for something big. An explosion. Now, this explosion isn't much different than the one described by cosmologists at the Big Bang. First, there was little to speak of, and then there was a lot. Remember that little compact and dense seed that precipitated that great expansion? Think of the Ediacaran fauna as being something like that, a precursor, or coming attraction of things to come. And come they did. In the era known as the Cambrian, an era which kicked off 541 million years ago, life exploded. And this explosion wasn't as sudden as the one which created the universe. That one happened in seconds. This explosion, the one that kicked off the Cambrian era, took place over a 30 million year period, give or take a few million. In the grand scheme of things, though, 30 million years is a very short period of time just the same. It might as well be seconds when you take into account the billions of years prior to that, where life moved along at a snail's pace, before there were even snails to set the pace. But during those 30 million years, natural selection began to produce new creatures, one after the other, a parade of unique forms and shapes that had never been seen before. Suddenly, there were creatures with hard exoskeletons, creatures which preyed upon other creatures, creatures which fought not only the environment to survive, but they fought against each other in open combat. These organisms populated the seas, and when they splashed, they really splashed. New groups of organisms also appeared during this period, forms that followed similar body plans that we see evidence of in the world around us today. There were also some that don't resemble anything that we've ever seen, things we couldn't even imagine if we weren't holding them in our own two hands.
The great discovery during the last 30 years is the recognition that many organisms in the Burgess Shale are weird and wonderful, unique anatomies representing groups that just died out. They're extinct, like most things that have ever lived.
That was evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. The Burgess Shale that he referenced is a giant fossil bed in British Columbia in the area of the Canadian Rockies. It was discovered in 1909 by paleontologist Charles Walcott. And during his lifetime, Walcott collected over 65,000 specimens from the shale. These specimens, or fossils, represent creatures which lived during the Cambrian era. They had a mix of soft and hard body parts. And what was truly amazing, though, was the difference in forms which hadn't appeared on Earth during any previous era. They were suddenly everywhere. One of the most recognizable forms to come out of this explosion of shapes during the Cambrian belongs to the trilobites. They didn't poke their heads up until the Cambrian era was well underway. They also have the distinction of being the first Cambrian fossils to be discovered, and also the most troublesome.
A most peculiar-looking creature this one is. I think it's the skeleton of a flatfish.
That was how the naturalist Edward Leeuwin first described what he was looking at. Nobody knew what to make of them. Their sudden appearance in the Cambrian fossil record also vexed Charles Darwin.
To the question why we do not find rich fossil deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods prior to the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer.
With the sudden presence of trilobites in the fossil record and the, what seemed to be, sudden appearance or explosion of new organisms present in the Burgess Shale, scientists and science had a lot to contend with and to explain. And the problem was, they couldn't. They could take stabs at an explanation, and all would agree that the Cambrian explosion had an explanation. They just hadn't quite unearthed it yet. It wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that progress was made and efforts to explain it started to promise results. In the 1970s, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge developed the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Now, simply stated, punctuated equilibrium says that life remains unchanged or in stasis for a very long time, and that when it does change, it happens very quickly. Think of life as basically one long run-on sentence punctuated by commas. Each comma signifies rapid change. While a good candidate for the Cambrian explosion, it needed a little bit more. It's all well and good to say that the history of evolution is a series of stops and starts, but what causes the starts? What happened during the Cambrian era? That was quite a start, and fortunately we have some more putty to fill the gaps with. The first crack to be filled was that the explosion might not be an explosion. It is a fact that the fossil record appears to be scant prior to the Cambrian, and prior to that there were no trilobites, there were no sea scorpions or creatures with hard shells. They seemed to appear out of nowhere to populate the fossil record. They represented nature's Big Bang. The reason we don't see the evolutionary path which led to the trilobites is because that path is littered with soft-bodied ancestors. Nature has a very hard time preserving soft-bodied animals as fossils. Soft bodies decay and disappear long before fossilization can take place. It isn't until those creatures began to develop hard parts and shells that fossilization could stretch its creative muscles and get to work. But we still need to explain why those hard parts seem to be in proliferation at the start of the Cambrian. If one wants to make the case that the Cambrian is the poster child of punctuated equilibrium, we need a little bit more. Like, say, how about an extinction event? it does make sense that an extinction event clears the slate and allows for new organisms to flourish in the vacuum left by the previous landowners. We were the lucky recipients of the Earth after an asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago. That event ended the dinosaurs' reign and gave mammals a chance. The same thing might have occurred at the start of the Cambrian. Only that time it wasn't an asteroid that did the trick, it was changes in the Earth's temperature. In the period before the Cambrian, the Earth had gone through an ice age. Now, ice ages do what refrigerators do. They slow things down. They slow metabolisms down. Warm waters turn cold and many creatures can't cope with that change. They die off and they disappear. The ice basically stamps them out. Then, with the Cambrian came warmer temperatures and the ice began to melt, waters rose, and new forms of life began to take advantage of the new landscape, or seascape. Here was a new environment to conquer. One with more water, more places to go, and more areas to survive in. And then there's this little thing called oxygen. Oxygen permeated the seas during the Cambrian. An increase in oxygen allowed for an increase in body size. The lower oxygen levels prior to the Cambrian would have prevented organisms from growing larger and to increase in complexity. More oxygen means more chances for change, metabolic changes which could not have kicked off before without those higher levels of oxygen. With them, those changes could now be activated, like the construction of solid exoskeletons, which coincidentally requires calcium. And we just so happen to have evidence that there was an increased amount of volcanic activity in the oceans at the time, which might have supplied ample amounts of calcium. Calcium was used by these oxygen-rich organisms to coat themselves with, creating those hard body parts. Now, when an organism attempted to devour another one, it might encounter a hard shell, and in order to survive, they needed to develop ways to crack the shell. An arms race was on, and life loves arms races. Just like rapid developments and new technologies pop up during modern warfare, the same thing happens in nature. Give nature a hard shell, and it will find a way to crack it open and get to the soft parts. Anything that would give an animal an advantage over another one would stick. And we saw this also in the Cambrian. A good example is bilateral symmetry. Prior to this, there wasn't really a defined front and back to organisms. They simply floated around and hoped to bump into food. An organism that could move away from the things that wanted to bump into it and eat it had an advantage. To do so, to move away, you have to be able to change direction. Now, if you're an amorphous blob, then every direction is the same. If you have a front and back, well, the front moves forward. The more times you can move away, the greater chances there are for you to survive and to have children, and develop harder shells. The Cambrian was a time of war, and life won. Now, we'll never be able to trace the apparent explosion of life forms in the Cambrian to one single cause. Many things contributed to light that long fuse that extended from the first single-celled organism to the trilobites and the rest of the creatures that poked their heads out of the Cambrian seas. Some of the factors which lit the fuse we now know of, such as increased oxygen and calcium levels, and the other things we have yet to find out about. And the war isn't over. It continues to this day. It's happening right outside of your window. It's happening beneath waves and in distant jungles. We may like to think that we've freed ourselves from it, but that's not the case. We are still very much a part of the food chain. Every time you enter the ocean or the forest, you're a part of it. We've just been clever and lucky enough to build virtual moats around ourselves. We may also be witness to another Big Bang of sorts. Look at it this way. The closer and closer we come to developing artificial intelligence, the closer we come to setting off another explosion of new shapes, forms, and methods for winning an arms race. It's a race without end, and we might just be a small mysterious blip on the radar. But for right now, we're here. Evolution Talk is written and produced by myself, Rick Coast. The music on this episode was composed and performed by Chad Crouch, also known as Poddington Bear. Support for Evolution Talk comes from you, simply by listening. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with someone. You can also help the show and its continued existence by visiting evolutiontalk.com/support. But most of all, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.